Welcome back, and in this lesson I want to cover S3 object storage classes. Now this is something which is equally as important at the associate and the professional level. You need to understand the costs relative to each other, the technical features and compromises, as well as the types of situations where you would and wouldn't use each of the storage classes. Now we've got a lot to cover, so let's jump in and get started. The default storage class available within S3 is known as S3 Standard. So with S3 Standard, when Bob stores his cat pictures on S3 using the S3 API, the objects are stored across at least 3 availability zones. And this level of replication means that S3 Standard is able to cope with multiple availability zone failure while still safeguarding data. So start with this as a foundation when comparing other storage classes, because this is a massively important part of the choice between different S3 storage classes. Now this level of replication means that S3 Standard provides 11 nines of durability, and this means if you store 10 million objects within an S3 bucket, then on average you might lose one object every 10,000 years. The replication uses MD5 checksums together with cyclic redundancy checks known as CRCs to detect and resolve any data issues. Now when objects which are uploaded to S3 have been stored durably, S3 responds with a HTTP 1.1 200 OK status. This is important to remember for the exam. If you see this status, if S3 responds with a 200 code, then you know that your data has been stored durably within the product. With S3 Standard, there are a number of components to how you'll build for the product. You'll build a gigabyte per month fee for data stored within S3, $1 per gigabyte charge for transfer of data out of S3, and transfer into S3 is free, and then finally you have a price per 1,000 requests made to the product. There are no specific retrieval fees, no minimum duration for objects stored, and no minimum object sizes. Now this isn't true for the other storage classes, so this is something to focus on as a solutions architect and in the exam. With S3 Standard, you aren't penalised in any way. You don't get any discounts, but it's the most balanced class of storage when you look at the dollar cost versus the features and compromises. Now S3 Standard makes data accessible immediately. It has a first byte latency of milliseconds, and this means that when data is requested, it's available within milliseconds and objects can be made publicly available. This is either using S3 permissions or if you enable static website hosting and make all of the contents of the bucket available to the public internet. If you're doing that, then S3 Standard supports both of these access architectures. So for the exam, the critical point to remember is that S3 Standard should be used for frequently accessed data, which is important and non-replaceable. It should be your default, and you should only investigate moving to other storage classes when you have a specific reason to do so. Now let's move on and look at another storage class available within S3, and the next class I want to cover is S3 Standard Infrequent Access, known as S3 Standard-IA. So Standard Infrequent Access shares most of the architecture and characteristics of S3 Standard. Data is still replicated over at least 3 availability zones in the region, the durability is the same, the availability is the same, the first byte latency is the same, and objects can still be made publicly available. You also have the same basic cost model starting with a storage cost, but the storage costs for this class are much cheaper than S3 Standard, about half of the price at the time of creating this lesson, so it's much more cost effective to store data using Standard Infrequent Access. You also have a per request charge and a data transfer out cost, which is the same as S3 Standard, and like other AWS services, data transfer in is free of charge. So this reduction in storage cost is a substantial benefit to using infrequent access, but in exchange for this benefit, there are some compromises which are made. First, standard infrequent access has a new cost component, which is a retrieval fee. For every gigabyte of data retrieved from the product where the objects are stored using this storage class, there is a cost to retrieve that data, and that's in addition to the transfer fee. So while the costs of storage for this class are much less than S3 standard, that cost efficacy is reduced the more that you access the data, which is why this class is designed for infrequently accessed data. Now, additionally, there is a minimum duration charge for objects using this class. However long you store objects, you're billed for a minimum duration of 30 days. And however small the objects that you store within this class, you're billed a minimum of 128 KB in size per object. So this class is cost effective for data as long as you don't access the data very often, or you don't need to store it short term, or you don't need to store lots of tiny objects. For the exam, remember this: S3 standard infrequent access should be used for long-lived data, which is important or irreplaceable, but where data access is infrequent. Don't use it for lots of small files, don't use it for temporary data, don't use it for data which is constantly accessed, and don't use it for data which isn't important or which can be easily replaced, because there's a better, cheaper option for that, and that's what we're going to be covering next. The next storage class which I want to talk about is S3 One Zone Infrequent Access, and this is similar to standard infrequent access in many ways. The starting point is that it's cheaper than S3 standard or S3 infrequent access, but there is a significant compromise for that cost reduction, which I'll talk about soon. Now, this storage class shares many of the minimums and other considerations as S3 infrequent access. There's still the retrieval fee, there's still the minimum 30-day build storage duration, and there's still the 128 KB minimum capacity charge per object. The big difference between S3 infrequent access and One Zone infrequent access, and you can probably guess this from the name, is that data stored using this class is only stored in one availability zone within the region, so it doesn't have the replication across those additional availability zones. So you get cheaper access to storage, but you take on additional risk of data loss if the AZ that the data is stored in fails. Now, oddly enough, you do get the same level of durability, so 11 nines of durability, but that's assuming that the availability zone that your data is stored in doesn't fail during that time period. Data is still replicated within the availability zone, so you have multiple copies of the data, but only, crucially, within one availability zone. Now, for the exam, this storage class should be used for long-lived data because you still have the size and duration minimums. It should be used for data which is infrequently accessed because you still have the retrieval fee, and this is specific to this class, for data which is non-critical or data which can be easily replaced. So this means things like replica copies, so if you're using same or cross-region replication, then you can use this class for your replicated copy. Or if you're generating intermediate data that you can afford to lose, then this storage class offers great value. Don't use this for your only copy of data because it's too risky. Don't use this for critical data because it's also too risky. Don't use this for data which is frequently accessed, frequently changed, or temporary data because you'll be penalised by the duration and size minimums that this storage class is affected by. Okay, so this is the end of part 1 of this lesson. It was getting a little bit on the long side, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to take a small break, maybe stretch your legs or make a coffee. Now, part 2 will continue immediately from this point, so go ahead, complete this video, and when you're ready, I'll look forward to you joining me in part 2.